Yet another road accident victim arriving at hospital. Every second counts, for this casualty has suffered severe head injuries. The danger? Damage to one of the body's vital organs. That organ, the brain. Meet Jordan McCann. When he was born, he weighed nearly 4 kilograms. One organ made up 10% of his body weight. That organ was the brain. Why does a tiny baby need a brain of that size? What does the brain do? The brain is the control center for the body. Together with the spinal cord, it makes up the central nervous system. Other nerves extend into all parts of the body. These make up the peripheral nervous system. The nervous system has 2 functions. Some nerves receive information and carry messages to the brain or spinal cord. Others carry instructions from the central nervous system. The former are made up of sensory nerve cells or neurons. The latter are made up of motor neurons. They go to all parts of the body. Back to the brain. It's greyish-white and the surface is wrinkled. This surface is in fact a thin layer of cells, the cortex, so large that it has to be folded to fit into the skull. The cortex contains 2/3 of the brain's nerve cells. There are 2 distinct halves or hemispheres.
Okay, if you want to go to but yes, but she could have the second one now.
Right, okay, yeah.
But what does the brain do? Every movement this baby makes involves the central nervous system and eventually involves the brain. You don't believe it? Watch this. This is an MRI, a magnetic resonance imager. With it, we can see the brain working. So, find a volunteer. He doesn't look much like our baby, but his brain works in the same way. Place him inside the machine. A small baby might find this frightening, hence the volunteer. Select the part of the brain you want to examine. The scanner gives sections or slices. Choose the slice you want. And ask the volunteer to wave his left hand. This is a section through his brain. This is what happens when the left hand is moved. We're seeing the additional activity in the brain caused by that movement. It's in a small area of the right hemisphere. Activity means that energy is being used. In the body, energy means oxygen, and oxygen means blood. The scanner is picking up increased blood flow. One part of the brain is stimulated. It's in the cortex on the right side of the brain. This forms part of the motor strip. Movements on the left of the body are controlled from the right hemisphere, on the right from the left hemisphere. Let's look at how a scan is taken. Julia has volunteered. She's a radiographer at the Maudsley Hospital in London, and there's nothing wrong with her brain. First, her head is lined up in the correct position in the center of the scanner. 2 lights are used, which intersect between Julia's eyes. Scans can take a while, so Julia's firmly clamped into place before she enters the magnet. This is a vertical section through the head. You can see the nose to the left, the neck and spinal cord at the bottom. The folds in the cortex are also obvious. But the cortex isn't the whole brain. Around the back, we can see the cerebellum, a specialized part of the brain involved in maintaining balance during movement. And underneath, a group of nerve centers which connect the brain to the spinal cord. So what's going on in our baby's brain? Well, perhaps less than you think, because many of these movements are random. It's the baby's way of exploring the world. And some are simple reflexes, rapid response movement. They require limited involvement of the brain. Ever burnt your finger? This is what happens. You pull your hand away. Why? Well, a message is sent along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. From there, a message is sent directly along the motor neuron to the muscles. It's a rapid protective response to get you out of trouble fast and doesn't directly involve the brain. So inside the spinal cord, the signal is received, a connecting neuron is brought into action, this activates a motor neuron and a signal is sent directly back to the appropriate muscles. You pull your finger away. Alice is 8 months old. She's learned to grasp objects and to move them to her mouth. It's a typical stage of development.
Does she do much rolling at home? Does she like being on the carpet and things? Are you sure it's a very clever trick? We give you a little thing to pick up. Are you going to try
It's a big step forward. These activities are thought out and involve coordination of hand and eye.
I don't want you to read it, though. Oh, no.
So what happens in the brain when the sight centres are stimulated? Back to the scanner and another volunteer. She'll be exposed to a flashing checkerboard pattern of black and white squares. You can see it there at the front of the scanner. Once again, sections will be taken through the brain. This time, they're chosen to show the link between the eyes, seen here at the top of the screen, and the brain. And this is what happens when the lights flash. Activity is concentrated in one area at the bottom of the screen. This is at the back of the brain, and it marks the sight centres, or the visual cortex. Compare this with the motor area we saw earlier. A completely different part of the brain. In the clinic, yet another test, this time for hearing. Jordan is very young, but already there's some reaction to noise.
What he did the first time was, and we don't particularly expect him to turn to sound at this age, but he actually held his breath for a few seconds and things and just sort of reacted to it in that way.
Another part of the brain is active. This time, 2 areas will be stimulated. These are the hearing centres. So the brain has many distinct regions. But what's actually happening in the brain? Let's look at one area of development, the motor area. Compare the actions of these children. Soon after birth, kicking and waving arms in a random manner. Within a few months, grasping objects and carrying them to the mouth. By 9 months, picking up small objects with a degree of precision and stacking them. Just over a year old and taking first steps. And by 18 months, sorting complicated shapes. A rapid development in a very short time. A development mirrored by changes in the brain itself. This is the brain of a young baby. Large, already 1/3 the size of an adult brain. Inside there are many nerve endings, but few connections. Stimulate the nervous system and this happens. The nerve endings seek contacts, and if contact is made, connections are established. So while a baby is learning to carry out more and more precise motor activities, the brain is developing more and more connections. This happens at a very rapid rate. More than half of these connections are made in the first 12 months of life, and most learning takes place in the same period. This is why a baby's brain is so large. Its potential is so great. It's also why the brain is so important and why it's so heavily protected.
Oh, it's going to go push that. That's it. Clever boy.
In fact, the brain sits in its own suit of armour, the skull. But even with such protection, it can be damaged. This tiny baby has suspected brain damage. and most of the children in this ward are under treatment for damage to the brain. But in most cases, impact is not the main cause of damage. The brain is constantly active. Non-stop reactions take place, even when you're asleep. After all, you still have to breathe. Your heart still has to pump. The digestive system still has to work. All of this is down to the brain, and this activity needs oxygen and blood. This scan shows the major blood vessels in the brain. The eyes are at the bottom of the screen. You can see the blood spreading through the network of fine capillaries. This blood supply is vital. In fact, it has to be uninterrupted. The blood supply to the brain takes preference over the supply to all other organs.
The brain is an unusual part of the body in that its oxygen requirement is very immediate and very high. It can only metabolize glucose within the cells. It uses glucose for energy, and it doesn't have stores of energy as other parts of the body do, like the liver, which has glycogen in it, and so does muscle. So that other parts of the body can last for quite a long time without oxygen, but the brain can only last for a very few minutes.
So what happens if the blood supply to the brain is interrupted? This has happened here. A clot has blocked a major blood vessel. As a result, little blood is getting into the finer capillaries. There's hardly any blood in them. No blood, no oxygen, and the cells die. This is what happened to Jeff Dolson. He was a senior systems designer for British Telecom. He also made musical instruments as a hobby. 6 months ago, he had a stroke. One of the blood vessels in his brain ruptured, and the blood supply to part of his brain stopped. The surrounding cells died. His speech was affected, but there were other, more unusual effects.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you a picture, and I want you to tell me what it is and what you do with it. Okay.
Some of the links between visual recognition centres and the language centres of Jeff's brain have been destroyed.
Yeah, it's for a cork, isn't it? What's it? It's called a cork.
Opens wine bottles.
Yeah.
Pull bottle.
Yeah, that's right. You pull the cork out of the bottle, so it's called a corkscrew.
Screw. Nothing.
Yeah, good. Right, Jeff. I'm going to say 4 words to you, okay? And one of them's wrong. It's the odd one out. Okay, so I want you to tell me which one it is and why. Okay. Scissors, knife, fork, spoon.
Spoon.
Okay, why do you think spoon?
I got scissors, knife,
Yeah.
and what's
Fork and spoon.
spoon?
Okay, why?
I think scissors and knife and fork.
Mhm.
Can spike. Is that right?
Physical damage to the brain, like Jeff's stroke, is quite common, and it can affect any part of the brain.
Scissors, knife, fork,
Scissors.
spoon.
There are a number of very strange phenomena with strokes where people, for instance, lose the ability to recognize the faces of perfectly familiar people, people in their families, or lose the ability to recognize shapes of familiar objects placed in the hand, and even may cease to recognize one half of the body and think that it belongs to somebody else. People after strokes have been known to push the affected arm out of the bed because they think someone else has climbed into bed with them, even though it is their own arm.
But as well as strokes like Jeff's, there are diseases which can affect the brain. This man suffers from Parkinson's disease. Symptoms include uncontrollable movements of the limbs and speech problems. At first sight, the scans look normal. But this scanner can be tuned to analyze the chemicals within the brain. The doctors select a box around the area they think is not functioning properly. It's at the center of the brain, and it's very small. The scanner now analyzes the chemicals produced by the nerve cells in this box. The information can be shown as a chemical spectrum. Each peak represents the amount of particular chemicals produced by nerve cells in this region of the brain. The higher the peak, the more of each chemical there is present. This is the spectrum for the affected area. Compared to the spectrum for an unaffected part of the brain, the peaks are higher. The brain is producing more chemicals. But what have chemicals to do with brain activity? Surely brain activity is electrical. Let's look at a typical nerve cell or neuron. They come in many shapes and sizes. An electrical charge is generated in the cell body. It passes down a long tube called an axon. At the end of the axon, where it contacts the next nerve cell, there's a gap called a synapse. When the signal reaches the synapse, a chemical is produced which passes on the signal to the next nerve cell and so along the nerve. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and it's one of these transmitters, dopamine, that's missing in Parkinson's disease.
It's a very frustrating condition because it doesn't affect intelligence. The people who have Parkinson's disease retain their ability to understand things and to be aware of what is going around them in a normal way, but they are unable to respond to it in a normal way. The affected person may have difficulty mustering their thoughts and getting started with their thinking in order to express themselves. And then they often have difficulty with initiating the speech process and actually being able to utter the words.
Because we don't respond immediately, it doesn't mean to say that we aren't interested or don't care. It's like being trapped inside a shell and unable to get out. You just have to give us a little bit more time.
With luck, these babies will never contract Parkinson's disease. Only 0.2% of the population does. And if they do, maybe there'll be a cure by that time. So they can enjoy the miracle of a brain whose capacity they'll probably never fully tap. A brain whose mysteries we'll probably never fully understand.